Hello, everyone. Welcome to the For Humanity presentation, AI Governance and Model Risk Management. We are thrilled to have such a great audience today. Uh, and we're also thrilled to have such a great list of speakers. So let me introduce them. We have, of course, Ryan Carrier, who is Executive Director For Humanity. I am also joined by Saeed Joshi, who is Head of AI and Machine Learning Risk at Barclays. I do want to note that Saeed's opinions, any opinions he expresses today, are hers own personally, and not those of Barclays. I am also joined by my old friend and webinar colleague, Andrew Perry. We have done, seems like hundreds of these. Andrew is the ethics evangelist at Abby. Do I have to say the same thing about Abby? Are these your own opinions, I think?
No.
Okay, these are opinions. And I'm Mike Simon. I am the attorney owner of the law firm Law Plus Data. Um, I'll own my opinions if only because there's nobody else here I can blame them on. So there you go. What are we going to talk about today? First part, we're going to have Ryan talk about how AI misaligns with MRM. We'll then go through what needs to change. Sahi will talk about that. Andrew and I will talk about operationalizing MRM compliance in the age of AI. And then we're going to end with a couple of calls to action from a bunch of us. And if we've got time, we'll have questions in there. If you have any burning question that you want to ask right away, please put it in on the chat. We're happy to take them as we're going along. And with that, I am going to stop sharing and hand this over to Ryan to share the slides as he is talking.
You can see the slide. Oh, did it start? There it goes. You can see the slides,
There
okay?
we go.
Excellent.
Yep.
Okay. Um, just background. Most of you know For Humanity, but quick background. We are a nonprofit public charity. We have actually now up to about 2,700 contributors from 100 countries around the world. The mission remains very simple. We examine and analyze the downside risk associated with AI, algorithmic, and autonomous systems, engage in the maximum amount of risk mitigations possible, and we do that through the advancement of independent audit of AI systems. The theory being that if we maximize risk mitigations around AI systems, then we maximize the benefit of these tools for humanity, and thus the name of the organization. All right. So we've, for the last about 16 months, worked to draft a model risk management certification scheme and to integrate it into SR 11.7 compliance, to compliance, to sort of harmonization with For Humanity's core AAA governance scheme, and essentially tried to create a mechanism for the way that model risk management can be approached by those organizations who are under the governance of the U.S. Federal Reserve. So this certification scheme is a modular component that relies upon that core AAA governance scheme. And for those of you new to For Humanity or learning about that, we are actually just finishing teaching our course on the core governance scheme. That core governance scheme thinks in pillars. And I'm going to show you two sets of pillars. I'm not going to dive into any detail here. There's an enormous amount of detail behind these. But we think in pillars like expert oversight and making sure that we have sufficient training and education, ethical oversight, risk management, data management, and governance. All of these are principles by which we establish audit criteria. For Humanity's audit criteria is designed specifically not to be just like standards, not to be law. What we do is we interpret the law, standards, guidance, regulation. We interpret them into binary audit criteria so that a trained independent third party auditor can come in into your organization, look at your compliance, and say with confidence, compliant or not compliant. turning the law, regulations, guidelines, standards into binary audit criteria under these headings and under these ways of thinking. The next slide that I'm going to show you is somewhat similar and somewhat of an overlap, but it highlights what the duty of top management and oversight bodies is for the governance of AI, the oversight, the accountability of what we call AAA systems, AI, algorithmic, and autonomous systems. So we don't need, from a for humanity perspective, to make a distinction amongst the different kinds of models. And so that actually facilitates this integration with model risk management. We already thought for and accounted for a world of the more static, algorithmic centric type of models that that model risk management would be very familiar with and very famous for already. Now, the reason I showed you these two, and I'm just going to flip backwards for a second, these two different iconographs, okay, is what I want to highlight for you as we talk about the integration of model risk management into a for humanity certification scheme. I just want to be able to give you visually an idea of how we accomplish that. So these icons are going to show back up, and periodically they show up singularly. Sometimes they blend together with a double color. So the blue and the green here and the blue for top management. And the idea there is to say, look, we have thought about what the duty and responsibility is in regards to this guidance as we interpret SR 11.7. Okay. So speaking of SR 11.7, many of you would be familiar with SR 11.7. If you're not, this is not a webinar on SR 11.7, so I'm not going to try to re-educate you, educate you for the first time. But in terms of thinking about model usage, okay, SR 11.7 talks about having an information component, a processing component, and a reporting component, and it thinks about and refers directly to sort of 12 types of algorithms that are governed by SR 11.7 and model risk management. The problem is we get to here. So when David Palmer, who was one of the original authors of SR 11.7, declared that SR 11.7 applied to all AI being deployed by organizations and entities governed by SR 11.7, what that meant is that there's a whole bunch of new use cases driven by AI applications inside these large financial entities. And essentially, those new use cases introduce a whole mess of risk, okay, and challenges to the existing MRM infrastructure. And so that's why we created this group, again, about 16 months ago, where we invited literally anyone to join. Over the 16 months, we had a lot of different people participate. And the idea is how do we apply the principles of model risk management, apply the governance, oversight, accountability that the Fed is looking to see in the context of AI, in the context of these new use cases that I just added. So let me talk a little bit about that. So basic guidance that had to be applied to AI remains that there needs to be a risk-based and a proportional approach to that model risk. We need to be able to uphold the principle of effective challenge. We need to have a governance of the model risk and certainly uncertainty. And think about that, the uncertainty of a large language model and when it produces hallucinations. That is exactly the kind of uncertainty that the Fed is talking about. Now, they didn't come out and say uncertainty in the context of large language models and hallucinations. They're talking about the uncertainty of the outputs of any model, okay? And we have to think about what that uncertainty means in many different applications of AI use cases. Then we have to be in a position to have good governance, oversight, and accountability. We need to monitor for model health and fitness. We have to have a process for managing change management. And then we need our normal independent model validation. For Humanity's work already blends very robustly with what model risk management does. Why? because independent audit of AI systems and the process that we espouse is built on the foundational principles of financial audits. So we already had this very natural integration. And you can see here by the icons on the bottom of the page, all of those 7 steps we've got covered in multiple different ways and places. And so really what we're talking about is creating robust integration. And that robust integration exists with existing model risk management, which is already key and critical to the operation of most large financial institutions, at least operating under the Fed's purview. But it also has to think about the context of that enterprise level risk management, because now we're bringing in maybe more cybersecurity. We're dealing with customers. We might be, most of model risk management stays internal, right, to the bank. Whereas now a lot of these artificial intelligence solutions are actually customer facing. And that introduces a whole bunch of new risks that MRM wasn't necessarily geared to handle in its original format. So really what we're bringing is the AI governance aspect of that fully integrated into the existing cogs of large financial institutions, their enterprise risk management, and their model risk management. And so as we begin to think about the difference between these models, on the left-hand side, you've got quantitative models that MRM is focused on. And on the right-hand side, we've got AI models. And I just want to point out a couple of things. In those quant models, the human oversight or human control, typically human in the loop or human on the loop. When we talk about AI models, For Humanity uses a 4-tiered approach. We allow for human in the loop, which is the most, let's just call it invasive oversight or integration into an AI model. Human on the loop, human in command, which is specially designed to meet the human oversight requirements of the EU AI Act. And then we allow for post hoc human review, which might be there's certain systems that should be fully automated, but you still need humans to make sure that it stays true to that model health and fitness, true to its purpose. The challenges that AI presents are thinking about things like explainability. Well, what about drift? So in normal stochastic kind of models, the models that MRM would be very comfortable with, we were probably only talking about data risk. Well, now we're talking about drift in the form of machine learning, where the model itself or even the concept of the model can drift as well. As I talked about, customer interaction is far more likely with the introduction of these AI use cases. And anytime you're dealing with AI, it's a socio-technical tool. So not only is the human receiving the output from it, but the human's embedded in it. And what that does is it introduces a very large amount of ethical risk all throughout the process. So the last takeaway I would have you learn from this slide, I guess, is what MRM was doing. If we called that moderate risk, everything that it was doing, but we categorize that as moderate, it needs to be clear and well understood that we're talking about more risk, a higher level of risk when we deal with these artificial intelligence systems. Okay. In addition, when MRM and SR 11.7 referred to the multidisciplinary nature of model risk management, they originally meant things like multidisciplinary in terms of economics. Like to them and to the guidance, the multidisciplinariness was economics, finance, statistics, mathematics, and that's multidisciplinary. Well, now when you introduce AI, now we're talking about having to expand into data management and governance, machine autonomy, multiple relevant legal frameworks that have to be drawn in, human rights and fundamental fairness, and ethical choices and their associated risk. Okay. And so again, the risk factor and the knowledge and expertise when For Humanity talks about governing, good governance, oversight, accountability, the very first principle is making sure that you have the experts in the room. And so what that means is we have to have greater expertise in the room to deal with AI risk from a model risk management perspective. And with that, I am going to stop my share and hand over to Michael and Sai. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Sorry about the jumping back and forth on sharing here. Oops, hold on. I shared the wrong one. Sharing my desktop.
You
You
had to
all
wait
see
for
my
me to
cool.
stop sharing, so now you're good.
Yep. Sorry about that, folks. We're jumping back and forth a little bit. Hopefully you can see the slide presentation in its full glory. And now we're going to talk about what needs to change in MRM from AI. This is a ground level view. This is a practical view on the what we're now facing. And Sai, can you walk us through the MRM journey just to start?
Uh, so, so I guess either way, and you've heard Ryan talk about this. Uh, SR 11.7 came out almost to the date 14 years ago, right? It was April 4th, 2011. As a result of that, a lot of the financial institutions, like the Fed and the OCC, have pushed financial institutions towards compliance over these 14 years. And in a lot of ways, when AI really took off, and especially Gen AI, the financial institutions, or when they, for example, the EU AI Act came out, financial institutions are already a fair amount along the way in terms of at least having the underlying frameworks and so on in place, right? And I think a lot of the credit for that goes to the regulators in the US. So in some ways, it was like there is already a framework in place. In other ways, though, we have sort of a completely different set of things that we need to worry about now. Because if you think about SR 11.7, and again, Ryan said this a number of times, conventional models, even the machine learning models that are used within banks to, let's say, predict fraud or, identify surveillance issues or, do KYC reviews and uh, uh, tag sort of anti-money laundering or, transaction monitoring reviews. These are all at some level a predict versus an actual, right? They're in the sense of SR 11.7, truly mathematical quantitative models. Now, don't get me wrong. LLMs are also mathematical and statistical and probabilistic because they are doing a lot of analysis underneath and saying what's the probability of the next word that comes along. However, when you look at it from a layperson's point of view, the output is not at all a predict versus an actual. It's actually giving you I don't know, a sentence, right? Summarize this paragraph for me, or summarize this meeting for me. And you could have two different people who look at the summary of the exact same meeting and have completely different reactions to, yes, that is spot on versus, it missed all the important things in the meeting. So to some extent, the evolution and the sort of explosion in the use of generative AI has actually created very new challenges for the MRM functions, right? Because now you have to look at things that are not as easy to identify whether they are right. It's used by a much broader set of folks than conventional models where, at the end of the day, a lot of times you had one quant talking to another and they had a greatly similar idea of how things should function. And so in order to extend the MRM SR 11.7 framework to generative AI is one of the challenges that we are facing now. So yeah, I'll take a pause and see if any questions or if Michael wants to add any comments there.
Well, I'll throw a couple of things. Well, first, let's see if we have any questions. Folks, you can come off mute and ask. You can put them in chat. You can do them however you want. We'll give people a minute. I'm seeing some thumbs up. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll throw in a few comments. First of all, it's when I talk to our clients about AI, the financial services industry is vastly far ahead of everyone on this in terms of governance and responding to regulation because of SR 11.7. Most other industries, they're still catching up and trying to figure it out. And I will say, at least until the last administration, there were efforts afoot in government to, in ways, import to adapt the SR-11-7, the three layers of defense MRM model to other areas, to other industries. There were efforts, I can tell you, afoot within labor and employment and employment discrimination. Those aren't really going anywhere, but again, it reflects the fact that this particular industry, this particular vertical is far more ready. Um, the final thing, and I'm going to throw it back to Sai just to comment back on it, is I have also found that in testing and working out on AI governance, that sometimes even just the small changes that you can get on outputs, it's not consistent. That alone can really throw you. It makes it very hard to test. Is that what you all are, is that what you are hearing as well?
Yeah, so testing output and how you monitor ongoing performance, for example, is a very, again, like because it's not a straightforward predict versus actual, uh, the ongoing and don't get me wrong, there are a lot of like the AI, the experts will tell you there's a lot of underlying statistics that they actually monitor and look at and so on. But if you do the what I would say is the intuitive assessment versus the statistical assessment for want of a better word, a lot of that is very, very subjective, right? And so you can put in place a lot of monitoring, but at the end of the day, is this thing really useful? And and here's the other difficult bit, right? And this may be going too far ahead and not necessarily a current problem. But let's say I come up with an AI use case, which is ostensibly going to save somebody 30 minutes a day, right? Because it summarizes documents better or whatever. Now, that may be true, but they may spend more time rewriting it, right? But over a period of time, it will get better. And so in a year's time, you may actually have a very different outcome. But being able to even monitor that cost benefit analysis and should I be spending the money to develop this tool or this use case, even assuming none of us are building our own LLMs, right? Like most people are buying them from one of the whatever big tech companies. Should I be building that use case and how do I monitor the cost benefit is very different from what happened in most of our classical models, right? Where you did all that, but then mostly it was the output of that would flag things that then needed to be looked at and so on. So I think being able to identify the ongoing monitoring, not just in terms of statistically, can I say that this model is doing the right things and do I have a bunch of automated tests and so on, versus is it really worth investing in? I think that's the other big challenge that a lot of financial institutions are facing. And then, of course, in terms of sort of ongoing people risk, like are we going to lose subject matter expertise? So let's say, and to give this in a straightforward example, think about trying to make our children read paper maps, right? Like all of us grew up driving, looking at a
You
paper
have
map, and you'd
paper
have,
maps?
well, didn't you?
I
Like
did, but I
back
don't have
in
any more. I threw them all
So
away.
this is my point. But just imagine, I mean, think of the Air France flight and today is a terrible day to talk about this because of the
Yes.
Ahmedabad crash, but think of the Air France flight that went from Sao Paulo to Paris, I think, and disappeared over the ocean. And after that, they started to make pilots relearn how to read stars, right? Now, admittedly, paper maps is, but that's a technology or I should say, that's a skill that's gone, right? Our kids can't read paper maps. I could still go back and read a paper map if I had to. I'm not saying I have to, but if I have to, like in the mountains of Utah, where there is no cell coverage, I have actually carried a paper map and said, okay, where am I going? Right? My kid couldn't do it. And so that subject matter expertise in terms of, I'm looking at a credit review. What's my intuition on whether is this a good, what do you call it? A good credit, okay? Or like here's a bunch of KYC files, and by this thing I can tell which ones are actually something I should trigger and file a SAR versus these are, not really a risk. It just appears to be that way. I think those intuitions that our more junior staff need to develop as they rise up in the organization, that's going to become harder and harder the more they use AI, right? And maybe they'll learn very differently in the sense that, I mean, there are things that my kids can do with AI that I couldn't. And maybe they will learn to think in those terms. But I think some of those longer term risks are also something we are grappling with. How do we handle? How do we make sure people develop the required skills and so on? Anyway, I'll stop talking. I know I've.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible they'll use the AI to solve the AI problems, which is scary enough alone. So,
What is it? LLM
let's
as judge.
Yep. Let's
Michael,
hit the next slide real quick. But I've got a comment from Ryan. So
yeah, just real quick. One thing that I wanted to mention is we started to talk a little bit about kind of administrations and their effect on governance. One of the most powerful independent regulators in the United States is the U.S. Federal Reserve.
yes.
It has as much independence as
So that's
any
possible.
organization might have. And you can expect that SR 11.7 compliance will be enforced, will be part of supervision, will be part of the guidance when the regulators come for a visit, despite the stance of the administration. And I think that's important for people to hear as well, because you can't just go, oh, the U.S. isn't regulating anything at all, therefore I don't need to worry about anything. That's not accurate in this case.
Yeah, I'm
And
gonna reemphasize that, if only because I'm the lawyer on the call. The the current trend towards eliminating the independence of what were independent agencies, EEOC, you can pick them, and the Merit Systems Protection Board, et cetera, and LRB. The Supreme Court has exempted the Federal Reserve Board from that. They are still independent, and these regulations will remain. You're absolutely correct. So that is a
and
very good point.
and I'll
So
add one more thing there, which is if you think about most, especially most financial institutions, they're actually multinational, right?
yeah,
So the PRA has just come out with SS 123, which is really SR 11.7 taken with all of the learnings that we've made over the past, whatever, 12
yep,
years at the time it came out. And they are expecting that anybody who wants to operate in the UK will have to comply with that. There's the EUAI Act, which obviously, even if you don't have a lot of say, it's anything that affects somebody who's in the EU, which means you need to be able to make sure that you're sort of you're compliant with that. So I think it's not like it, even though in the US maybe that, and SR 11.7 is a guidance. So at the end of the day, because it's not a law or a regulation, actually the Fed has in some ways more power to say, hey, this is a guidance, but we expect you to follow it, because they're not it's not a legal requirement. It's actually the Fed pushing banks towards it, right? So I don't think there's getting away from SR 11.7 anytime soon. And I'm not sure I want to, by the way. I think it's a very commonsensical guidance. So
well, we've seen how these models can go wrong. We've seen, and some of these seem almost trivial, but we've seen, for example, with Air Canada, we had a chatbot giving somebody wrong advice. Air Canada had to pony up. It admittedly only cost them $600, but it makes them look bad. We've had other instances where AI has done dumb things or wrong things, and it's a bad look. It's a bad reputational risk for a multinational global institution that has trillions of dollars of people's money to have AI doing dumb and bad things. So, in fact, that's a good segue because our final slide is about how AI creates those gaps. So can you walk us through this, Sai?
yeah, I mean, I think I've already covered most of this in terms
You've
of the
covered most of
things
it, but
I've said
we'll
already.
do it in a structured way.
But I think to actually carry that forward from what you said, right, which is some of the very specific, unique risks that, let's say, generative AI models bring to the table, which is things like hallucination, model poisoning, let's say the data. So what it's built for, like So let's say you have a large language model. Now, its ability to actually talk financial terms may be very different from one built specifically with financial information and data, because a lot of times, frankly, the generic ones say things which most of us are like, even my mother knows better, and she's not even a finance person. So I think some of those, I mean, it does bring a lot of these unique risks into sort of the picture, right? And we need to learn how to handle them. And to your point, it's not just the reputation risk of large financial institutions, but the fact that you could actually have systemic risk caused by, let's say, pure poor use of a model. I mean, Air Canada at the end of the day, fine, like they had to pay somebody $600, but imagine if like Silicon Valley Bank kind of failure is caused by, oh, my AI told me let's go invest in these highly illiquid things, right? Um, you could have real systemic risk that arises out of a bank model failing, and all of those risks are just enhanced in today's world. So
Yeah, I mean it's in the end you point out something very important, which is it's not just the chat bots, it's not just the customer facing areas, which again, the Fed has said you have to govern those as if they were
right.
quantitative models, but it's also the stuff you're using to potentially extend or replace models. I've got clients, they've written their business plans with AI. They're doing their coding with AI. They've built their
Yes.
websites with AI. And I'm going to throw this to both you and Ryan. Does the next step we're going to see generating quantitative formulas using AI? Is that what we're heading towards?
I mean, have you seen this thing called Codex? I was
Oh
just given
no.
a demo by somebody who is like, here's 30,000 lines of the code. And oh, would you like to change something? Yes. Woohoo, here's all the things I changed. And I'm sorry for because I'm not really a coder. Now, how do you actually get anybody to read that and do peer review? Right? So basically, you get another thing and so if there's a bug in there somewhere, and not even intentionally, just accidentally, how am I going to actually find it? Right. So therefore, I need to make sure my tests are like absolutely accurate, right? Or
Yeah.
whatever, actually solid. So
Uh,
sorry, Ryan.
No, that's okay. As a hedge fund manager, 9+ years ago, we developed AI to do exactly that. So we had AI that was essentially seeking and learning new algorithms to produce for the management
Yes.
of commodity spreads. It was
Yeah,
so
yeah, yeah.
so I am 100% certain that this is pervasive usage.
Yeah.
So I do want to say one thing. I know the way we've all been talking, and I am definitely a risk person, but I will also say, like, there are phenomenally useful capabilities, right? Like, so I don't want to be like the only the nervous Nelly in the room. So
No, I think we've all got reason to be worried about the risks. And we're in this time, it feels like my college age daughter likes to use liminal. She would call it a liminal space. We're sort of between things. We've got amazing technology development and but we haven't quite caught up on how we're going to best use that technology. The wisdom, the ability to govern it isn't quite there yet. And so I think that makes for an excellent transition. And thank you, Sai, and thank you, Ryan, because it's a great transition to what Andrew is going to show us, which is a way to use a different type of technology to solve these problems of technology and to do that testing when you've got inconsistent outputs. When you've also got, by the way, the other thing we haven't talked about is outputs at just ludicrously overwhelming scale. It's one thing to say we're going to do 3 lines of defense and we've got 100 models or 1,000 models or even 10,000 models. But what happens when you're going into the millions and the outputs are in the millions because you're making decisions faster than I can snap my hand? So with that, Andrew, I'm going to stop sharing and let you take it away to our next section.
Thanks so much. Let me just share my desktop. and make sure that you can actually see it. Great. So as Michael mentioned, this is a great segue into a discussion of how do we actually operationalize model risk management compliance. And in that context, I think it's important to define what do we mean by operationalizing model risk management compliance. And to put it succinctly, it is really about auditability and traceability of compliance obligations to meet three specific mandates or goals. First of which is to essentially address regulatory oversight, and both Sai and Ryan talked about that. Second is to mitigate legal liability and reputational damage. Now, both Model Risk Management SR 11-7 and the EU Artificial Intelligence Act specifically mandate the need for auditability and traceability. In fact, Section 12 or Article 12 of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act specifically requires organizations to maintain what's called event logs associated with their business processes. And if you're wondering, why are we talking about the EU Artificial Intelligence Act? Well, if you are an entity that's placing on a market or putting into service AI systems in the EU, regardless of your location, you will be subject to the provisions of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. And as Sai pointed out, most banks are certainly international organizations, so they would be governed by the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. The second point I want to mention here is that Model Risk Management, SR 11-7, is a general supervisory guidance. So it has to be applied in the context of specific use cases, and some of which is highlighted on this slide here, but certainly credit decisioning is one, to adjudicate, for example, credit decisioning outcomes and to ensure fair outcomes in terms of lending. Secondly, anti-money laundering and know your customers to ensure that they're able to comply with stringent regulatory mandates. And as another example is capital stress testing using macroeconomic models to look at the bank's capital position. Now, having said that, we're going to really focus this discussion on credit decisioning. And why are we focusing on that? Well, first of all, research shows that large banks already have implemented AI across their entire credit decisioning business processes. Sai and Michael mentioned this, that obviously deterministic rules-based systems have been deployed in banks for many, many years, but now we're seeing the introduction of more advanced generative AI and agentic AI solutions. In fact, 40% of the banks surveyed expect to implement these more advanced solutions within the next several years. Secondly, AI is deployed across the entire life cycle of a credit decisioning system, from application submission. So, for example, using more advanced intelligent document processing solutions like OCR technology to extract information from documents that the loan applicant is submitting. Identity management, for example, is also being deployed in banks to ensure that they're dealing with the right individual. Also, of course, credit scoring underwriting is using more advanced machine learning technology. And then in terms of customer notification, AI is being used to automate highly repetitive tasks and ensuring that they can more effectively and proactively respond to customer requests. So having said that, there's a fundamental challenge in operationalizing the ability to assess the performance of your credit decisioning system across its entire life cycle. Why is that? The reason for that is that these systems, such as credit decisioning solutions, deploy various disparate systems of record. There's inconsistencies in the data format. As you can see here, whether you're talking about the front end of the process or the back end, there's a whole range of disparate applications that are being used to manage and support the business process, including, of course, inconsistencies in the data. So when we talk about compliance and operationalizing compliance, we're talking about the accountability and traceability of compliance obligations across the entire life cycle of the credit decision business process. But herein lies the challenge: fragmented data and disparate systems of record. So how do we address those? So there's two things that organizations can consider in implementing a holistic end-to-end approach to managing compliance obligations across a credit decision lifecycle process, or for that matter, any sort of critical banking applications that leverages AI technology. The first of which is what's defined as ETL. Now, let me explain for those of you on the call who may not be familiar with this. So ETL stands for extraction, transformation, and loading. So there's 3 steps of the process. One is to extract raw data from different disparate systems of record. Second is then to transform that information to a normalized format. And thirdly is then to load that formalized data into an application to visualize and analyze the business process. Now, this might sound really complex, but even today's world, there are more advanced low-code, no-code based applications that makes it really easy to transform data from these different systems of record into a normalized format. And therefore, even line of business professionals can effectively deploy this technology to create a normalized view of their event logs. So what does it look like when we actually talk about an event log? So this is just an illustration. But when you normalize event logs from different systems of record, you need at least 3 proxies or 3 sort of fields, one of which is an object. So for example, in the context of credit decisioning is the loan application itself. The second is an activity. So for example, that the loan application submitted or was evaluated by an underwriter, or an approval decision was made. And the third is a timestamp, when the activity occurred. So an object, an activity, and when it occurred. And you can also add additional proxies, like, for example, who is the resource allocated to that specific task and associated costs, right? So once you have that, then you can deploy the second component of operationalizing risk management, and that is using what's called process mining technology. So again, just a definition here. So what is process mining? Very simply is process mining using these normalized event logs from these different systems and to automatically, and I want to emphasize, automatically map, analyze, and monitor the performance of the business process across its entire life cycle. So how does that actually operate in reality? So I'm going to show you a few sort of screenshots of what you can expect to be able to visualize your business process, right? So this is essentially a virtual dynamic schema that represents the entire process flow. So in this particular instance, as a demonstration use case, we're actually using 6,000 unique loan applications to evaluate how the process, in fact, is performing. Now, what you can see here in this dynamic schema are, first of all, activities which are represented as nodes and arrows which represent the transition of events from one state to the next state. And you can see some performance metrics, for example, how many times a particular process occurs between 2 nodes. For example, as well, to look at the time that is taken to process these events and transactions from one step to the next. And also the volume of these transactions, right? So this kind of give you a sense of how you can actually create a visual map automatically from these event logs. The second point I mentioned is that once you create these dynamic schema views, then you can actually look at, the distribution of events that are occurring across the entire life cycle of the business process. So for example, of the approximate 6,000 use cases, you can see how many have been approved, for example, how many customer complaints have been received, how many confirmations of customer complaints, for example, but also you can see here, of the 6,000 cases, how many of these cases perhaps have experienced violations against prescribed protocols. And we can then drill into the root causes of what occurred here and how to potentially remediate that, right? Another important aspect that once you load these event logs into a process mining environment is then to look at what's called conformance analysis. And that is to be able to look at what is the prescribed process. So what you can see here on the left-hand side is a determined specific sequence of steps that must occur in evaluating how the actual credit decisioning process behaves, and look at potential deviations from prescribed processes, as well as to look at SLAs that require to complete the business process itself. So what you're doing here is really an analysis between what ought to be a prescribed process, how should be executing, and then secondly, is it executing against those prescribed protocols? And this is where you can then see what the results are. So you can look at the distribution of potential anomalies that can occur. For example, how many missing steps have occurred? Has there been a specific process followed in a particular sequence? For example, was the process executed and maybe some steps were executed in the wrong sequence, wrong position, or there may have been a time violation associated with the execution of the business process. Once you have this kind of granular detail, then you can actually look at the root causes of why this is occurring. So then you can look at specific, distinct, unique cases and be able to drill in what happened in that particular case and what specific steps should be taken or potentially taken to remediate the business process, and making sure that you actually document it so that when regulators ask about it to say what happened here in terms of deviations from prescribed thresholds, you can actually document what happened and what steps you have taken to mitigate those downstream risks and control those risks. And then finally, a couple other things I want to mention here, and that is you can also look at a much higher level analysis of what's happening in a business process. So you can do distribution analysis of how many cases, for example, have taken a certain amount of time. So you can do distribution analysis. What is the distribution of cost across all these different cases? So you can really drill into and look at some performance metrics associated with the performance of your credit decision business process. Another way of looking at this is to drill in specific distribution of how the process has behaved. So for example, this is what's called a path analysis. And you can see here the specific steps related to the credit decision and business process, the ideal process flow. But then you look at, for example, deviations from this. For example, in this case, what happened in terms of maybe additional steps for verification of incoming documents, missing steps. And of course, in this case, the level of rework that had to be undertaken to maybe clear up the incoming documents. And also, of course, missing steps in the business process. You can really look at a very granular analysis of what's happening in a business process. And then finally, you can also provide sort of executive dashboards to senior management to look at the overarching behavior and trends associated with the execution of the credit decision and business process. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to gloss over these couple of things, but just to reinforce what Sai mentioned earlier, is that this sort of process of operationalizing model risk measurement compliance is really important in the context of a more advanced generative AI system. There tend to be stochastic models. There's an element of randomness to it. And so there's an increased level of obligation to ensure that the outputs generated from these AI systems provide the necessary criteria, accuracy, reliability, and of mitigating potential downstream biases as a result of the application of these systems. And then we actually published a white paper, and just want to very quickly go through this, but really to identify in this white paper, as we have done, where the potential gaps exist within the current MRM SR 11-7 implementation, and how process mining can actually fill those gaps. And the white paper is really addressing those requirements in more detail, and we'll provide you with a link to the white paper. I'm going to conclude on this slide because just want to mention that Mike and I, in the context of Law Plus data, are leveraging the work for humanity, but quite independent of for humanity. And we're incorporating these capabilities in terms of advisory services, but also we're very proud to have a relationship with Abby as our technology partner. And the underlying technology that I sort of highlighted in terms of some screenshots is based on Abby's process AI technology, Abby Timeline, that allows you to have these capabilities of out-of-the-box visualization of business processes across the entire life cycle. And so we are working closely with Abby to deliver both advisor services and solutions capabilities. Just want to conclude, and Mike, feel free to kind of cover this, and then we still have 7 or 8 minutes for questions.
Okay, and I'm going to leave the slides with you, so I'll just ask you to advance them when we get there. But thank you, Andrew. That was great. I will emphasize that those very detailed little workflows that I have created that Andrew was kind enough to show because he knows I love to create my little graphics are in the white paper. They're a lot easier to read through there as opposed to on a screen at a webinar. And we do explain how they work and tie that into how process mining works. So that brings us to our calls to action. We've got two sets of them, one of them coming from Law Plus Data. And we've got three here. First of all, what can we do in terms of working with what we've helped build within For Humanity and as an Abby technology partner? Well, for what we can do is we can help first determine those gaps between MRM and the For Humanity certification schemes. There is a basic core autonomous systems governance scheme. Ryan has talked about the top management and oversight body scheme. There are also schemes for the EU AI Act generally, and specifically for the Article 4 literacy requirements, which, by the way, are already in effect. And finally, of course, there's the most detailed one for this area, which is the MRM compliance schema for AI models, where we have created that crosswalk between MRM and AI governance. And, I'm very proud of the fact that, I'm one of the four people helping to build this, and you've got the other three people right here speaking. So this is how we've built this out. We can also help you then plan out and scope out how you take this to actually the next step to implement and operationalize it. And we provide advisory services. Again, not as part of For Humanity, but we provide advisory services in terms of, well, I put implantation. Well, that's good. I'll have to fix that. We'll fix that in post-production. Implementation, training, and education. You gotta love autocorrect, right? So Ryan, with that, hopefully not any additional implantation calls. Talk about what For Humanity can do on its policy accelerator, please.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
We established our AI policy accelerator to help implement EU AI Act compliance. We've taken that model and it's really just a contractual arrangement that allows us to bring all of our volunteers in to do work with someone who wants to bring an AI to the policy accelerator. I would love to see implementation of our model risk management approach on a single AI system so that we can all learn if we've built something that's robust and that covers all the holes and gaps and is as implementable, easy for me to say, as we think it is. And so we can do that inside the AI policy accelerator. It's a great way to contribute to the learnings in this space by being the first guinea pig to come in, but you get an enormous amount of value by participating in the process for your time and for your very small financial commitment. So that AI policy accelerator, we can operate in any or most jurisdictions, and we do so with you as the leader. So we're suggesting what the outcomes look like, and you're saying, yes, I want those outcomes. And then we say, here's how you achieve those outcomes, and then we execute together.
Yeah.
See,
And
I knew actually it was hard to say. Implantable is a lot easier to say, even though it's not, of course, correct.
Sure.
So
I should
who
also
knows?
mention,
Yeah.
I should also mention that quite independent of this presentation, Abby actually has and continues to work with For Humanity in developing Abby's own AI risk management policy. And I just want to accentuate that, For Humanity has been extremely valuable to Abby to help us develop this policy and making sure that we are compliant with the provisions of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act. So certainly, from our experience, it's a great initiative.
Which is a very important thing to know. This is tested, folks. This is not something that, you're going to be the first company, the first organization to have to do this and work out the bugs. It's been tested and it works very well. as you've heard Andrew say. So let's take us to questions. Do we have questions, folks? This is your chance. We got 3 minutes left. Because if not, I've got one. I'll ask it. Going once. All right. We'll jump on one if one comes in. But I'm gonna ask a question that has definitely been bugging me, which is a couple days ago I saw someone who is a pretty well-known quant within the industry posted on LinkedIn about how models can perform flawlessly but still fail, not because the math is wrong, but I'm going to quote this, because it learned the wrong reality. It talked about unlabeled, undetected, policy-driven distortions could be why the model succeeded versus the math. Um, First of all, to Ryan and Sahi, is this something you've seen? Is this something that's truly happening? And then to Andrew, if so, is this something that process mining can help with?
I'll take it first. Absolutely. We've seen it. We know it exists. We know that the transition of governance to kind of these new spaces has been rough and has been challenging and has been incomplete. We often say there's no one in the world right now today who has sufficient governance, oversight, and accountability to meet the For Humanity certification schemes. A lot of this has to be learned, built, even just getting the right experts in the room. Organizations are not organized along these lines yet. And so that's a huge first step.
I certainly, unless Saeed has additional comments to add, I just want to comment that certainly, process mining is inherently designed to address these kinds of use cases. So, governance, obviously inherently involves specific steps that must be followed. As long as there are systems of record, process mining can in fact analyze it, visualize it, and see where potential compliance gaps exist in the context of a governance framework.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. And with that, we'll take our last minute because we do want to end on time. Can we go to the last slide, Andrew, please? I want to thank everyone for attending. This has been a great event. This has been an honor to work with this group of panelists. Ryan, thank you as always. Andrew, another one we've done. And Sahi, I know you're busy. I know you've got a big role and a big week, and I very much appreciate the time you've been able to take out of your day for this. And so with that, I will thank final thank yous and say we are done. And if you have any
Thank you very
questions,
much.
additional questions, reach out to us.
Yeah, thanks everyone, and
Thank you very
we'll be
much.
following up with you. Thanks everyone.